is an Around the A off-season update with David Foote and Patrick Williams on the Sports Podcasting Network.
It's a big day here on Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network. Perhaps our biggest guest ever outside of, maybe the commissioners and the presidents and CEOs of the American Hockey League that we've had on in the past. But big guest coming up, Brian Burke, the longtime general manager, player agent, and former player, will be with us later on to talk a little bit about his new book, Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey, and as well to give us some of his prognostications on how he thinks things might shake down as far as a season goes moving forward for the American Hockey League and, of course, the NHL. It's an exciting show that we've got on the way, Pat. Really looking forward to getting to pick the brain of a guy like Brian Burke for a little bit.
Yeah, just like Brian Burke, it doesn't get any bigger than that. I mean, you mentioned we've had Dave Andrews, Scott Helson, a big guest, Mike Gamrick. And then I think, frankly, we've had a lot of people from individual teams and like coaches and media. Brian Burke, though, has worked at the pinnacle, really, of the sport. When you're the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs, right off the bat, I mean, that's one of the highest profile jobs in this business. And certainly he's been a GM for a Stanley Cup winning club like the Anaheim Ducks back in 2007, Calgary Flames, Vancouver Canucks, Hartford Whalers. That's how far back he goes. And then, interestingly, I think is the fact he's worked as a player agent back in the 1980s when it was really starting to become a much bigger part of the game. So he's seen it from the other side of the desk, if you will. And then he's been a player. He's a player for Lou Lamoriello at Providence College, and then played a year in the AHL, the 1970s, as a Philadelphia Flyers prospect. So certainly somebody who has seen the game from many different angles, has been there for the evolution from the 1970s game and all the way up till today working for Sportsnet. So we're really happy to have him when he agreed to come on. That was a big acquisition for our show. And I think the fans will really enjoy it, hearing all his thoughts. And we go pretty in depth on the AHL. He's worked very closely with the league for a long time, knows this league inside out as well as the NHL. So, have a lot of insight for our fans and listeners.
And we're not going to make the listeners wait too long to get to Brian Burke, but we do have a couple of things to talk about. While the headlines have been quiet in the AHL and the NHL as they try to work together with the players to figure out how to get an upcoming season off and running, there has been some news out of the ECHL, the third tier, if you will, of the North American professional hockey, and they've decided that their North Division is not going to play this year, Pat. Which, despite the fact that we're not an ECHL show, is going to have some ripple effects across the American Hockey League.
Absolutely. 6 clubs, in addition to the 2 clubs earlier, the Atlanta Gladiators, who are the ECHL affiliate of the Boston Bruins, and then the Norfolk Admirals, the longtime AHL team themselves, who are independent in the ECHL, also sitting out this season. And that's what we know for now. There's still some other clubs that are a little bit more up in the air as well. But there's a huge spin-off effect for sure. When you think about, there are players that come back and forth all the time, especially those East Coast as in location clubs. You have Adirondack, who are with the New Jersey Devils. Well, them in Binghamton, they send players back and forth all the time. Brampton and Belleville, another example. Reading, Lehigh Valley, Worcester and Bridgeport, Maine and Hartford, the Toronto Marlies, and the Growlers up in St. John's. Really, I think the Toronto Maple Leafs are one of the real front runners in terms of establishing that 3-tier development system. The NHL, the AHL, the ECHL. It's become at least before the pandemic, a much more popular model for player development. It's a chance to get maybe some of those more diamond in the rough type players, the guys that are a little bit more question marks and simply need a lot of playing time, a lot of development and skill time. I think of a player like Mason Marchment with the Leafs. Started off in the ECHL with Orlando, and that was their affiliates, and they put a lot of time, a lot of effort into developing him, and became a pretty good player at the American League level eventually. And is right knocking on the door now. He's since moved on to the Florida Panthers. Has a good chance, I think, at some point to break into the NHL full time. And a real success story, a real example of what that 3-tier model can do. So now when you take those 6 clubs out, plus the 2 other clubs, Atlanta and Norfolk that I mentioned earlier, all of a sudden now that's 160 fewer jobs that are available at that level. It's that much more difficult if you're an AHL club and you do play this season to send a player down to get some playing time. So that means you have more guys hanging around. Now maybe that will be useful if the coronavirus is still circulating at some point and you start to have players, test positive, like we've seen in the NFL and Major League Baseball. If you're not in that bubble situation, it's really difficult to keep players healthy, despite your best intentions and best efforts. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a factor as well. But it's difficult right now. And you look at those clubs, ECHL teams, they do a lot of the real grinding work of building hockey's popularity, especially in the States and some of the, quote unquote, non-traditional markets. Like down south, especially. They run on a pretty thin margin in the best of times. And now you're sitting out for an entire season. It's just very difficult. ECHL people, I've said this before. I mean, you're not in that business to get rich. You're in that because you love hockey, first and foremost. And a lot of people that have worked their way up, especially coaches. You think of the coaches that have come through the ECHL, like Peter Laviolette, got his start down there. A lot of guys that willing to grind, and you kind of wear a lot of different hats in that role at that level. But it's a great way to build a name for yourself and work your way up, eventually get to the American League, and then, if all goes well, to the NHL. It's a huge piece of the puzzle that's going to be missing to some extent this season. Like you said, the ripple effects, the spin-off effects, I think could be fairly considerable.
So some of the big headlines out of the ECHL this week, things still quiet on the AHL, NHL front for now. Of course, if anything does break, we will make sure to break in with a new episode so you don't miss the latest news from around the league. Why don't we get to our guests then, Pat? We don't want to keep the people waiting for a name like this. Brian Burke has been around the game for decades, and he's got a reputation of being a little bit gruff, maybe a little bit brash, perhaps a little bit scary and intimidating, depending on where you fall in the spectrum of hockey folks that deal with him. And I'd have to be honest, I was a little apprehensive heading into the interview that maybe that's what we might be in for, a little bit of that type of personality, but pleasantly surprised with his candor. Of course, we did this interview a little bit earlier on in the week to fit his naturally busy schedule, but boy, it was a whole lot of fun to chat with him, and we learned a lot and heard a lot of good stories.
Yeah, Brian Burke, certainly has that reputation for being gruff, and I think he can be gruff. I think if you get on his bad side, he can be your worst nightmare, especially in the media. There are stories that players who've run afoul of him have not had a pleasant experience. But I think he's a straight shooter, and let's be honest, I don't think we always get that in hockey. I think there's a tendency to sort of say nothing, and it's the easiest way to sort of skate through and not cause any ripples. And but if you're a Brian Burke, you've established yourself enough that you can get away with being honest. And I think there's nothing wrong with honesty as long as you're fair. And I think that's the approach he took with his new book, Burke's Law: Life in Hockey. He said that he tried to walk that line between spelling it out how it is, or at least how he saw it, versus not deliberately just trying to take runs and pot shots at people. So that's a fine line. There's, despite hockey's sort of very bland, I guess is the right word, hockey speak at times, I think, behind the scenes, hockey people are extremely opinionated. I think Brian Burke kind of pulls back the curtain on that a little bit and gives fans and media a real sense of what really goes on. And I read his book cover to cover in about a night and a half. It was that good. And, I think he brought that same intensity, that same energy to our interview with him as well.
Yeah, he talks a little bit about being a student at Providence College, his brief time in the American Hockey League, and then some stories from beyond that when he moved into being an agent and general manager and now an analyst with Sportsnet. We'll talk to him about all that, plus what he expects from the upcoming season whenever it begins. Brian Burke joins us next on Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network. You've been obviously around the game a long time. You've done a lot of different things in your career. Why did you decide now was the right time to publish a book and to tell some of your stories?
Well, first off, I'm really offended. When you introduced me, you didn't mention former AHL alumnus and Calder Cup winner.
We were going to get to that.
Okay. I was approached by Stephen Brunn about doing a book right after we won the Cup in Anaheim in 2007. And I told him at the time I felt I had too much hockey in front of me and it would have to wait. But in February of 2018, Ken King, the late, great Ken King, my boss, came to me and said, we're making a change at the end of the year. And that's the deal we made when I went to Calgary, was once they felt that whoever I brought in as GM was capable of running it without my guidance, that they would let me go. So no surprise, it wasn't unfair. But I had some free time that spring, so I started doing an outline on the book. This is my early life, when I started playing hockey, and turned into a 100-page outline. And then I went to Stephen Brunn and hired him to actually write the book, and he did a great job.
Yeah, and obviously you get into all aspects of your career, including that Calder Cup win that I know, reading part of it, that you were sadly left out of, I suppose, due to the circumstances and the type of series that was going to be. What was the AHL like, during your time playing in the league?
Well, I loved playing in the American Hockey League. I never thought I'd get a chance to. I didn't start playing hockey till very late in my youth, and I never dreamed I'd get to play pro hockey. And when I got to play 7 games in Springfield in the spring of 1977, and then play on a Calder Cup championship team in Portland, Maine, 77-78, I loved it. I loved the guys. I loved the free time. I think I read more books that year than I read in the next 10. Because I remember one road trip, I brought 8 books, and I finished the 8th book right as we pulled into the arena. And I was thinking, geez, I'm going to have to go buy another book. So I loved it. I loved the guys. Bob McCammon was our coach, good guy. We had a championship team, which was fun. The city of Portland was great. So I loved it. I hated going back to school.
You mentioned that when you left Providence College, you went directly to the Springfield Indians first. And you mentioned at that time the commitment level of some of the players on that club wasn't really what it should be. Player mentality has changed quite a bit since then. What was that atmosphere like walking in there off the campus of Providence College?
Well, so I played at Providence. I played for Lou Lamoriello, played 4 years, played with Ronnie Wilson, graduated as a co-captain and with the record for games played, and a very serious student and a very serious athlete. So when I turned pro, I expected the same, and it was funny because at that point when I turned pro with the Springfield Indians, half the team was Washington Capitals prospects and half was Philly. And the Washington Capitals prospects weren't. It was very different. They weren't as serious as the Flyers prospects were. It was a bit of slap shot, like you said, but it's a different era too. So the 2 stories I tell in the book, the first period of my first game, we played, I think it was Providence Reds. 7 guys lit cigarettes in the dressing room in their stalls after the first period. The coach, I swear to God, Dennis Palaffi, who I lockered beside him, he sat right beside me. He lit a cigarette after the first period. He had 99 points that year, I think. He was a great player, great guy. But that was accepted back then. The coach is talking to us about what we have to do, and guys are smoking cigarettes in their stalls. 7 guys. And the first road trip we took, we went to Hershey. We were playing in Hershey, and the trainer came to me and said, how much beer do you want for the bus? So I'm a rookie, right? So I said, I don't know, how much is everyone else getting? He said 2 6-packs. So I gave him the money for 2 6-packs of beer, which I think was $2 back then, and maybe even less. And anyway, so we get on the bus, and each guy had bought 2 six-packs, but the team put 4 flats of beer on, 4 full cases for the team too. So they had this pile of beer in the center of the bus and bags of ice on top of it to keep it cold. You had to walk on the seat handles to get over the pile of beer to get back to your seat. So, yeah, it was very different then.
What was life like on and off the ice with Springfield and Portland back then?
Well, we didn't have a gym in the rink in Portland, so Norm Barnes and Norm played, I think, at Michigan State, and one of the strongest guys I ever played with. They got us free memberships at a health club, and they had a beautiful health club in downtown Portland. And Norm and I would go lift every day after practice. And he was married and had a baby that year, so he missed the odd day. But we went a lot. And Mike Corney would play with me early in the year. He got traded early. We would all go after practice and lift weights. And so there was a very serious side of it. And our team was excellent. Like, we were a great team. Obviously, we won the title, but life was good. Like, Portland is a beautiful city now. Back then, it was not so nice. It was kind of just starting to. There's a lot of old buildings there. They were just trying to refurbish them and get some restaurants open, and it's beautiful now. Back then, it was about maybe a quarter of the way there, but the fans were fantastic. The thing about playing pro hockey is you have so much free time. That's the best part about it. So my roommate and I, Tommy Gorence was my roommate. We lived right across the highway from the practice rink, so I would walk to practice. He would drive. He didn't like walking through the woods, but it was great. I loved pro hockey. I loved the lifestyle. I loved the guys. I loved the free time, and it was fantastic.
Today, you often hear players, and with regard to their coaches, they like to ask the question why a lot. They want something explained to them. With your coach there, Bob McCammon, what was different then in terms of how players and coaches related to each other?
Well, back then, and they're going through the same shift in the military in the United States. Back then, you never questioned the coach, right? Like, Keith Allen was our GM. I called him Mr. Allen. My players call me Berkey. You never say, "Hey, Keith." It was Mr. Allen. And Freddie Shero was the coach of the Flyers. It was Coach Shero. You didn't call him Freddie. The players did that played there, but I would never have done that. I think the difference with the players now is back then, Bob McCammon would say, "Do this," and if you didn't do it, you would sit. And now I think you have to explain more to the coaches. And again, they're going through the same transition in the military. World War II, the colonel points up the hill and says, "Take that hill." Everyone charges up the hill. Now you have to explain why the hill is important, how many soldiers will be involved in the mission, what the potential loss of life is, and so on. It's not all a bad thing, but I think you have to explain more to this generation of players why you're doing it. You can't be as hard on the players as you used to be. Like in the old days, keep in mind, long before I played, in the old 6-team NHL, it wasn't uncommon to get sent down they would pin a train ticket to your pants. So you would come off the ice from practice, and there would be a train ticket pinned to your dress pants. And that's how they told you were going down. So we've evolved since then. And now the new evolution is you have to explain things more to these players and make it make sense to them. And that's not all bad.
We're chatting with Brian Burke about his new book, Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey. You were obviously a prospect with the Philadelphia Flyers, and at that time, and even now today, I suppose, the Flyers have a certain way of doing business, so to speak. How did things in Philly and the way they operate influence your career?
Well, we were on the tail end of the Broad Street Bullies. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people get this wrong historically. Everyone blames the Flyers for the fighting era in the NHL. It really started with St. Louis. And the Flyers played St. Louis in the playoffs and got badly pushed around. And Mr. Snyder, the late, great Ed Snyder, and Keith Allen, the late, great Keith Allen, vowed that would never happen again. And that's when Philly went out and got tough. So we were on the tail end of that, and we were a really tough team, and we fought a lot. I think we emptied the bench maybe 6 times that year, including once in the conference finals. And in the Calder Cup conference finals, we had a bench-clearing brawl in Halifax. So we were a real tough team. We fought a lot. It was part of our DNA. And certainly lived on with me. It was part of my team's DNA as well.
In the book, you describe a pretty honest discussion with a young Brett Hull when he was a Calgary Flames prospect playing in the AHL, and pretty much told him that he literally needed to get in shape. In your days as an agent and a general manager, did you have to have similar discussions with other young prospects, and how have those discussions maybe changed over the years?
Well, I think the athletes have changed. Like when I played, you used training camp to get in shape. I remember Moose DuPont, when I was in training camp with the Flyers, riding the bike with a garbage bag on to try and make weight, try and lose some weight. Back then, the veterans used training camp to get ready for the season. Training camp was about a month long, 3.5 weeks, and that's when they got in shape. Now, these kids never really get out of shape. Like the testing results that we have with NHL teams, you've got 3 or 4 guys, maybe half a dozen guys who aren't where you want them to be in terms of VO2 max or different testing results, but they're still in better shape than 80% of the population, 90% of the population. So the training aspect of it, these guys do a great job of that, way better than we did. And they're better players. Like these kids we get out of junior and college, they can do things that 3rd and 4th year pros couldn't do back then.
Mm-hmm.
When you look back that 1 year in Portland, it seemed like you really struggled with that decision to whether or not to go to law school or to stay in hockey. Can you recount that discussion you had with Keith Allen and the honesty that he delivered to you that maybe at the time you didn't necessarily want to hear, but long-term proved to be very good for you?
Yeah, so for people who haven't read the book or unfamiliar with the story, so when I was a senior at Providence, I was accepted at Harvard Law School, mainly because Lou Lamoriello made me take the LSAT, the law school admissions test. And I got accepted at Harvard and deferred for a year because I hoped I'd be able to play pro hockey. So now it's the end of the year. We won a Calder Cup. I did not play that much in Maine. I did not play that well in Maine. I think if you two had watched me play, you'd say, kid, go to law school. But I didn't know that, right? I didn't start playing hockey until I was 13. I had come so far and worked so hard. I was really reluctant to let that go. So when I signed with the Flyers, I signed a 1+1, 1 year plus an option year. So I could have played another year. I could have gone back and played. And that's what I was intent on doing. And then I started thinking about it. I was driving in Western Canada. I went on a road trip to see 2 of my teammates get married, Drew Callender and Al Hill. And in between, I went to Alaska, and I started thinking, the turning point for me was in March. I was a right wing. We had 2 wingers get injured. So John Paddock got hurt, and Larry Romanchuk got hurt, I think. And I thought my ice time was going to go up, and it didn't. They moved people over from the left side. And I should have seen right there that, okay, this is not good. And I did see it. But driving through Western Canada, I'm like, I had gone down and met with the Dean of Admissions at Harvard Law School and said, can I defer for a second year? And she said no. And she said, I've looked at your file. If I were you, I would come. In other words, you weren't the first person we admitted. You barely got in. Don't screw it up. And if you don't go, if I didn't go that year, I had to reapply. And there's no certainty you get back in. So I started thinking about it, and then I called Mr. Allen, and I said, what do you think I should do? He said, well, if you were my son, I would tell you to go to law school. I don't think you're going to play in the NHL. So it was like getting kicked in the groin as an athlete when someone looks at you. Your boss looks at you and says, you're never going to make it. But it was brutal honesty and great advice. So I went back to school, and Mr. Allen was great about it.
That first season, you mentioned you had come so far in hockey after starting late in your childhood. What did you find the biggest challenge with the pro game as a player?
Well, I had my 4 rules. So I talk about in the book, when I started playing hockey, I said there's only one of you are going to make it and play college hockey. That was my aspiration, was to play college hockey, not pro. Mm-hmm. And so I came up with my 4 rules, which is 1, be the hardest worker, game and practice. 2, be a coach's dream. In other words, everything the coach wanted you to do, I did. So if you're supposed to stand right here, and when we're killing a penalty and the coach shows the film, Brian Burke is standing right here, right where he's supposed to be. So be a coach's dream, be an indispensable teammate, be a guy that teammates valued, that you stick up for, and they knew they could count on you. And then 4 was to play hard and tough. And you get to pro hockey, and everyone followed those same 4 rules. They all worked hard, and they were better than I was. So my 4 rules kind of fizzled out. They were great to get me that far, but at that point, all those NHL guys or AHL guys had those same rules. They did listen to the coach. They were coachable. They did things right. They were good teammates. They worked hard, and they played hard, and they were tough. And so now it comes down to skill level. At this point, these rules only buy you so much real estate, and then at some point, when everyone has followed the same rules, you've got to be as good as they are as a player, and I wasn't.
From there, from Harvard Law, you went eventually into the agent business. You mentioned Gates Orlando with the Rochester Americans, going through kind of a difficult stretch there, something you see a lot of veterans go through in the American League. What was your advice to him, and how do you relate, both as an agent and a general manager, to those guys where the NHL window's starting to close and they're in that gray zone of their career?
Well, that's the hardest part in any athlete's career, is knowing when it's time to go. And normally, the industry tells you when it's time to go. And you talk to players that go over and play in Europe, and they know it's time to go to Europe because nobody offers them a job in North America, and so they go to Europe. Or they get offered an American League job in Europe, and they go to Europe because they can make $250,000 versus $75,000 or whatever. And so, to me, I looked at Gates Orlando, who's a great minor leaguer, great guy too. Still works for, was working for New Jersey up till last year, I think. Still, wonderful young man, but and a gifted college player, like a star at Providence College, and a really good American League player. But his skating just wasn't good enough, I don't think, to play in the NHL. And that's this one skill that keeps 90% of guys out of the NHL. You go to the AHL, and you see guys who can shoot the puck, and you see great hockey sense, and you see NHL quality toughness. The one skill that keeps most guys out of the NHL is their feet, and that's what happened with Gates. But I think it's a hard discussion at the end where you say, look, I got nothing. Not one team has offered me a thing. It might be time to look to do something else. That's a hard conversation to have.
Back in your earliest days with the Vancouver Canucks as a general manager, you had a dual affiliation in Fredericton with the Quebec Nordiques. What were the challenges of that affiliation, and then eventually, what was it like to launch a new affiliation in Milwaukee of the International League back then?
Well, we were not happy with our affiliation with the Quebec Nordiques. It was a bad deal financially. We paid all of our players' salaries. We had half the team there, and we chipped in toward a certain cost, including a Christmas party and a year-end party, and we weren't happy with the deal. Pat Quinn was not happy, and I used to watch them play. You guys will get a laugh out of this. I could not leave Friday morning and get there in time for a game Friday night. I had to go Thursday night. So I would take the red-eye Thursday night from Vancouver, land in Toronto, go to the airport hotel, and there's a Sheraton right in the hotel, and there's a Marriott right beside it. I'd sleep for 4 hours, catch a noon flight to Halifax, and then connect to Fredericton and get there just in time for the game. Like, it was crazy because you got 3+ hour time change and all that distance. So I'd have to leave on Thursday night to watch the Fredericton Express play on Friday night. It was a terrible setup for us geographically. It was a poor deal for us financially. So we moved the next year to Milwaukee, and Phil Whitliff was the guy that ran the hockey team with the Milwaukee Admirals. A wonderful human being, great player at Notre Dame, not Saskatchewan, University of Notre Dame. And he was our liaison, and we had a great experience in Milwaukee. We had good teams. We had good coaches. We had really tough teams. Ronnie Wilson started coaching there. Mike Murphy coached there. Kurt Fraser coached there. So we had really good personnel come through there, player-wise and coaching-wise. Pete DeBoer, who's coaching in the NHL, played for us in Milwaukee.
You mentioned geographical affiliation, and that takes me into the 2000s with the Anaheim Ducks, and you were one of the big proponents of a West Coast presence for the American League, which was something at the time that was considered just such a unusual idea. But can Can you take us through that evolution and how that unfolded? It was such a long, multi-year process.
Well, we talked about it when I was in Vancouver. Pat Quinn was a very progressive guy. And he was like, we got to get some teams on the West Coast here. And I talked to a bunch of teams about it. Then when I went so that goes back to probably 1990, goes way back then. We started talking to teams about it. And then when I went to Anaheim, I actually, with Jillian Samueli, who's the owner's daughter, who's a talented, bright young lady, she and I toured a bunch of the venues on the West Coast that were in the ECHL or in one of the lesser minor leagues. We went to Fresno. We went to Stockton. We went to Bakersfield. We went to San Diego. And we started evaluating what buildings would be suitable and what lease arrangements were made. And we never got much traction with the other NHL teams. Like I talked to the LA Kings. They were in Manchester. They were having great success for a couple of years. They were pretty happy. We had great success in Portland. Kevin Dineen was our coach. The 3 full years I was at Anaheim, we played in 14 playoff series. The big club played in 8. So we played in 3 my first year, 4 my second year, and 1 my third year. The Portland Pirates played in 6. Like there was no other team close to us in terms of being competitive at both levels. But long after I went, so I was in Calgary, and these guys put together the West Coast expansion. So you added San Diego, Ontario, California, Bakersfield, Stockton, and it's been a tremendous relocation in terms of players being recalled and so on. Now, in the current labor dispute, we're going to see how that affects the American League because if there is an all-Canadian division, which I believe there will be, the teams that have their farm team in the States, which would be Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary, I think are going to have to operate those teams out of somewhere in Canada for a year.
Couple more questions here for Brian Burke. His new book, Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey, is available now. The AHL's in a pretty big stage of transition right now, Brian, moving from Dave Andrews, the longtime president and CEO, to Scott Housen. In your experience with both of those guys, how do you see this transition going, and how good of a fit is Scott Housen to take the reins, especially at this difficult time?
Well, I think Dave Andrews, I don't think his impact on the American Hockey League can be overstated. I was with him through the merger of the IHL, then the Canadian or the California division came in. He's been a firefighter for much of his career, putting out fires here and there and ownership changes and all that. And he did a remarkable job, just a fantastic job as head of the American Hockey League. And those are big shoes. But I think Scott Housen can fill those shoes. I think Scott Housen's very bright, very organized. He works hard. He knows how to forge alliances with people. He's very popular. I think he'll do a great job. So I think that was a great selection. I was not involved. Like I wasn't on the selection committee or involved in any way. But I think Scott Housen, even though he's got huge shoes to fill, will fill them nicely.
And last question, you mentioned the potential of a Canadian division. I mean, we get asked almost daily about what the upcoming American Hockey League season might look like. Do you have any thought on how things might shake down moving forward, and how difficult is this to figure out from the executive standpoint as far as how we get a season together right now?
Well, I don't know what it's going to look like. To me, I just talked about this with the NHL. We have to play. Like, we have to play the games. Like, I worry not so much in Canada, but I worry in the U.S. with unemployment where it is and not playing, that people will find other things to do. So I think we have to play. If that means no fans or socially distanced fans, we have to play. We have to buy time until we get a vaccine. So in my mind, if I'm still running the Calgary Flames and we're playing in Stockton and we have to play to no fans, we're still going to play. Maybe an abbreviated season. Maybe it's socially distanced as time goes on. Maybe as a vaccine gets distributed and people get inoculated, the crowds can increase. But I think it's critical that we play, because otherwise people find other things to do. It's that simple. And we're dealing not just with the COVID, we're dealing with the high unemployment rate. And the first thing that goes when you sit down at the kitchen table with your wife and she just lost her job as a teacher, or you just lost your job working in the oil patch if you're in Calgary, and you sit down and say, okay, what can we eliminate? How can we cut our spending? Guess what the first thing you cross off is? Tickets to professional sporting events. That's number one. Vacations is number two. You go camping instead of going to Disney World. But I think we have to play, and that's going to be some financial hardship for the NHL teams involved and for the independent AHL teams. I get it, but we need to play. And then hopefully the cavalry is on the horizon now with these vaccines. Hopefully we're back to normal next fall.
Until then, if you need your hockey fix, some fantastic stories in Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey. Brian Burke, thank you so much for your time and your stories. We really appreciate you taking the time for us.
Thanks, guys. I love the AHL. I love your product, too.
Finishing up this off-season update on Around the A on the Sports Podcasting Network. Massive thank you to the fantastic Brian Burke. Again, if you skipped through to the interview and didn't hear our tee-up to him, I at least was expecting something a little bit different. Extremely happy with the way that turned out. And boy, the guy's got some stories, and we should say that those stories are just the tip of the iceberg of what you'll find in the book, Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey.
Yeah, I highly recommend Brian Burke's new book. He really went right from the time he was a kid. His family moved around quite a bit. Originally, he's from Rhode Island. Eventually, ended up in Edina, Minnesota, right outside the Twin Cities. And I found the interesting part about his background was he didn't start really playing hockey in any sort of organized sense until he was 12 years old, and that was a time when the typical Canadian story. You're 3 or 4 years old and you have skates on, and here's a player back then at the time, the late 60s, early 70s. Had a lot of ground to catch up on, and within about a span of 6-7 years, ended up going to Providence College, playing for Lou Lamoriello. That was an experience, and he goes into quite a bit of detail on that on that front. So you think about the work ethic that it took to make up that ground in a span of 6 or 7 years to get from where you're basically just starting off in hockey to you're playing Division I at a top school like Providence College, and then before long you're 22 years old and you're playing the American Hockey League at a time when there were far fewer teams. He came to the league, there were 6 clubs, so spots were very much at a premium at the time, and he came in with the Philadelphia Flyers in their system, and the American Hockey League, as he went into at that time, was a much different league, a lot more,
as we heard,
flat shots, and the long bus rides and the old arenas and the gruff coaches, just almost a different era altogether. So he really put the spotlight on that, both in our talk with him here and also in the book. So, yeah, if you're a hockey fan right now, especially if you have a little bit of extra time on your hands, highly recommend that book. It's a great read. It was a long time in coming, as he discussed with us, going back several years. He started keeping the diary, but certainly worth it. I found that book just a really enjoyable read.
And it's called Burke's Law, A Life in Hockey, and it's available at most bookstores and online. Might be a nice Christmas gift idea as well for the hockey fan on your list. And once again, we thank Brian Burke for his time here on Around the A. If there's anyone you'd like to hear from, you'd like us to try to get a hold of, because we have been having some success in nailing down guests during what is still a slow time, shoot us an email, aroundtheapod@gmail.com. Get at us on social media at aroundtheapod, and we'll see what we can come up with as far as guests go. We can tell you next week, another pretty big guest in the world of hockey management and executives goes. Howard Dolgan, the owner of the Syracuse Crunch, who we have referenced on this show numerous times before, has reached out to us and wants to come on. So we're going to talk to him next week.
Yeah, it's a theme here. Very outspoken, very honest people. Brian Burke, Howard Dolgan, kind of cut from the same cloth. Guys that wear their heart in their sleeve, speak their mind, not afraid to ruffle some feathers. Howard Dolgan has been one of the real longtime faces in this league. A guy that's brought hockey back to Syracuse in 1994, built that franchise up from the ground, and is now part of one of the best affiliations in all of hockey with the Tampa Bay Lightning. He's a guy that will speak his mind time and time again. And I think the interesting thing with him, especially throughout the pandemic here for going on 9 months, he's really been aggressive in putting the message out to his fan base and really to fans all around the league. He's held a number of press conferences, Zoom conferences, just trying to put his team out in the spotlight and keep the fans interested in hockey. Fans are kind of thirsting for any sort of information right now, as we all are. And there hasn't been a ton, but if he's had information, he's put it out there. So when he contacted us and said he'd like to come on the show, I didn't have to think very long about that one. So I think he'll be a great guest, just like Brian Burke was. Really give us insight on both the business as a whole and more specifically what's happening right now as we look toward that possible February 5th start date for the American Hockey League.
Yeah, lots to figure out until then, and maybe we'll get some tidbits from Howard Dolgan about how the process is actually going, since nobody really seems to have much of an idea of exactly what's going on. We'll do our best to clear that up for you next week, and then continue to move on with whoever else we can dig up during this extended off season as we approach the holidays, and then eventually in the new year, hopefully get back on the ice. We'll wrap it up for now. Again, thanks to Brian Burke for his time, and to everyone who tuned in and listened. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you are listening, and head over on the social medias at Around the A Pod for all the latest. You can find old episodes there as well.
This has been an Around the A offseason update on the Sports Podcasting Network. Stay up to date on the latest news and notes from the American Hockey League by subscribing to Around the A wherever you get your podcasts. And find us on social media at Around the A Pod.